You're listening to a Times Higher Education podcast.
Hello and welcome to Campus Talks, the podcast in which we seek insights on how to improve different areas of higher education from those working in the sector. I'm Miranda Prynne, and this week we are focused on international branch campuses and what institutions need to consider when setting up in a new country if they want to establish a long-term presence. Transnational education continues to gain prominence as a way for universities to reach students in other countries, and while TNE can take many forms, branch campuses are certainly the most flashy way of delivering TNE, also possibly the most risky. While there are many success stories of now well-established branch campuses all over the world, there have also been many, sometimes pretty embarrassing failures in this space. In numbers, courtesy of the research group C-BERT, we know there are currently 387 international branch campuses open across 85 countries worldwide, and a further 73 that have been opened and then closed. If there was a golden age for international branch campuses, it was the early 2000s, when there was a flurry of universities from major host countries such as the US, UK and Russia, opening in the Middle East and East Asia, with China, Dubai, Malaysia and Singapore proving particularly popular locations. Then there was a lull in enthusiasm over the last decade, following a number of high-profile closures and U-turns, alongside tighter budgets, and perhaps a growing understanding of the complexities inherent in setting up institutions under new educational, political and regulatory systems. But branch campuses appear to be back in fashion, with a number of announcements of new initiatives from institutions in the UK and Australia in recent months, and India, Vietnam and Greece all opening their doors to these educational ventures. Plus, in the UK, the government's new international education strategy, which came out in January, places a strong emphasis on transnational education as central to achieving its desired growth in education exports of 7 billion to 40 billion by 2030. And if anyone needs reminding, that is just 4 years away. So it's a goal that may prove quite difficult, as we will hear shortly. Now on to this week's guest. I spoke to Christine Ennew, who served as provost and CEO of the University of Nottingham Malaysia from 2013 to 16, having also been part of the team who travelled to Kuala Lumpur in 2000 to establish the branch campus. She also spent 5 years as vice-chancellor at the University of Nottingham, and most recently she was provost at the University of Warwick until she retired in 2023. Given Christine's pivotal role in setting up and running one of the first branch campuses, and one that has endured, I was keen to find out what lay behind the success of that initiative in the hope of drawing out lessons for others. We discuss the thinking behind branch campus endeavours, what's needed for sustained success, common criticisms of branch campuses, and we touch on the government's international education strategy and what impact it may or may not have. Over to Christine. Hi Christine, welcome to Campus Talks.
Hi Miranda.
How are you enjoying life after higher ed, as it were?
Well, not as quiet and relaxing as I thought. I'm still involved in various ways with higher education and more broadly with education and a charity. So I'm finding more than enough to keep me occupied, as well as keeping an eye on how things are developing in the sector.
Yes, no, I can't imagine that you'd simply be sitting on the sofa twiddling your thumbs. Anyway, look, You've held a number of very prominent posts across the university sector, most recently as provost at the University of Warwick. But more crucially, for the purposes of this conversation, you were provost and CEO of the University of Nottingham Malaysia from 2013 to 2016, and part of the team that helped establish this pioneering and still flourishing branch campus. Before we get into the nitty-gritty of what that involved, I want to start by getting your take on just what is the point of branch campuses. Cynics would say they are just another way for universities to make money out of international students. So would you say there's any truth in that, or is there a lot more to this?
Well, I think universities will inevitably have different motivations for establishing a branch campus. For me, one of the dominant ones is really about talent pool. And as universities, we want to work with the best staff and the best students. And by operating in country and reaching out to students who might not otherwise come to the UK, or indeed staff who might not otherwise work in the UK, you have the opportunity to work with some incredibly talented individuals. So it broadens out the talented pool that a university can reach. And that to me is a really critical motive. I think there are also considerations around broader reputation and brand. I think there are learning opportunities from being in a different environment and a different system. There are some great research opportunities, different funding locations, new collaborations, different research sites. And yes, there are financial considerations for some. I'm not sure that many branch campuses are huge money-making ventures, but then I'm not sure that higher education is a money-making venture. And I think it's the talent and the research and the learning opportunities for me that are the dominant motivations.
Yes, and actually, the point you make that each institution will have different priorities or focus areas is a really important one, because this is not a homogenous group of institutions. Like, each branch campus is going to have its own unique identity. And, there's a vast number of them, I'm sure, all very different. What's in it for the host country, would you say?
Well, again, I think host countries have a mix of motivations. For many, it's about bringing in additional capacity in a higher education sector that perhaps is under pressure of demand from young populations. I think for some countries, the branch campuses have been a way of attracting international students. That was certainly a consideration in Malaysia, where the presence of prestigious international universities was seen as a way of bringing students from across the region to study in Malaysia. I think host countries recognise, again, opportunities to learn and benefit from different approaches to teaching and to course offers, and also, of course, from the benefits of accessing research expertise and building collaborations. And again, so host countries will vary, but I think it's all about boosting the higher education sector in terms of capacity and also in terms of its capabilities.
Yes, yeah, that makes sense. I mean, if you look at somewhere like India that has recently opened up to become a potential spot for branch campuses, of course, their student population is just absolutely enormous.
And they just can't, you can't build universities from scratch quite quickly enough to deal with the level of demand in somewhere like India.
Yeah. Turning to the University of Nottingham, Malaysia, which has just celebrated its 25th anniversary, now has, I think, more than 5,000 students. So is a real notable success story in this space where there have been plenty of casualties as well as victors. You were involved in the initial setup of the then fledgling branch campus in Kuala Lumpur, and that was back in 2000. What was the thinking behind that specific project?
First and foremost, I think there was the consideration around talent. Nottingham had a long-standing tradition of welcoming students from Malaysia to the UK campus, so there was a strong connection. and some very talented Malaysian students had been through Nottingham. But I think there was a recognition that this was an opportunity, and bear in mind, this was an era when TNE was starting to really take off. This was an opportunity to do something different to traditional TNE models, but to reach out to that broader talent pool who would not have come to the UK. They would not have perhaps been able to afford it, or personal circumstances would have precluded it. So I think there was that talent argument. Students, definitely, staff as well. I do think there were considerations around brand and reputation, and Nottingham wanting to see itself as an international, a global institution. And then I think there were some real serious commitments around research, or at least serious aspirations around research and the opportunities that being on the ground in Malaysia presented.
Yes. And when laying the foundations for getting this off the ground, I mean, presumably there wasn't really a blueprint to do this because it was one of the earliest projects of this kind. So how on earth did you navigate the necessary steps?
Well, that's right. There wasn't a blueprint. I mean, Monash was slightly ahead of Nottingham, and of course there had been, various attempts. There was a big US initiative in Japan in sort of the 90s, but yeah, there wasn't a model, and I think, the vision then was very much driven by the let's create another Nottingham in Malaysia. And of course, ultimately, if you look at the campus, it pays considerable homage to the Nottingham UK campus. But there was an awful lot to learn, and lots that I think that we wanted to do that we suddenly worked out weren't going to actually work as well as we thought. So for me, there was something about being quite agile at the start and being willing to try and adapt and learn. But certainly the original thinking was about recreating a version of Nottingham UK, so recreating a campus that had that broad-based campus experience as well as the core academic experience.
I can see that's very helpful having something that links if an institution is going to have multiple campuses based around the world, something to link them. But presumably equally important is setting those campuses within their local contexts, sort of meeting local needs, adapting to local norms. So I wonder, can you point to where that was necessary, where the differentiation becomes necessary?
Yeah, sure. And I do think that's really important because I don't think you can or should, simply say let's transplant the UK model into Malaysia. You have to adapt and you have to adjust. So there are things such as education system level considerations. So you had a greater diversity of high school qualifications in Malaysia. So we had to think and adapt access routes in. Some students might finish at the end of year 12 with a particular qualification. Others might do a more traditional year 13. It was much more common in Malaysia for students to transfer to a foundation program at the age of 16 as a pathway. So that required us to adapt aspects of the academic offer to fit with the HE system. There were, a number of regulatory requirements. So Malaysia had certain requirements from private universities about things that they had to build into their curriculum. And again, we had to work out how we were able to do that. And then when you get down to your own curriculum, there are things that you teach that would be entirely relevant in the UK, but clearly not appropriate in Malaysia. So my classic example was on our MBA program, we taught financial and monetary policy. We taught UK and European financial and monetary policy. Well, in Malaysia, you taught a Malaysian and a regional perspective on that. I think we then discovered that you needed to go a stage further, and perhaps there were subjects that would be popular in Malaysia, but less so in the UK. So we were able to develop degree programs that were Malaysia specific. And then beyond that, you go on to think about lifestyles, types of accommodations, the sort of social interests that students have, the food offer, and all of those were things that you needed to have, but you wanted to be relevant to the local context. So I think you're adapting at multiple levels, but trying to retain, the kind of core values of the home institution.
Yes, yeah, that makes sense. And some of the things you reference there are those examples when you talk about the need to be agile, to learn as you're developing, learn what's working, what's not. Would you say those are things that you were kind of learning as you did it?
Oh, absolutely, yes. Yes,
Yeah.
because I think there was a lot that we didn't know. And I think we probably started thinking that we could copy a lot more from the UK. And as we got going, we discovered that actually, no, that didn't quite work, and we needed to be open to doing things differently. And we did.
From that point of view, one could argue not having a blueprint was quite helpful because it meant you could just be very open to what hit you.
Yeah. The other thing I would add there is one of the things that was hugely helpful was the locally recruited staff, who were an incredibly valuable resource because they were the ones who would say, that's fine, you might do that in the UK, it won't work here.
Now, skipping on to 2013 to 16, when you led this institution, can you tell me a bit about these 3 years and perhaps touch on what were at that point the key challenges and opportunities and how you steered the ship in the right direction?
Yes, there were a number of priorities that I had, or that the university had for me as the provost and CEO. It's a very macro level, trying to develop and consolidate the particular competitive position that Nottingham had. So thinking about how we sustained and developed our messaging around quality, trying to ensure that we could be credible as I say comprehensive. I mean, we weren't comprehensive in a UK sense, but as a broad-based institution. And I think even then we were still working on getting that balance, a distinctive UK character, but also locally relevant and locally adapted. So that was a work in progress. And I think we were making progress and had made progress in that, but it's always an ongoing project. I was keen to try and see how we could build the campus as Nottingham's regional hub. So not just about working in Malaysia, but actually having a broader ASEAN position and using Nottingham, Malaysia as a basis for building partnerships, both for Nottingham, Malaysia and Nottingham, UK, but in the ASEAN region. There was, I think, a big agenda around building research because although we had great ambitions about research, it was slow to develop. We worked quite hard at building our research profile and also to building industry links. And then of course the underlying requirement about financial sustainability, because financial sustainability was a real challenge, and trying to get to break even. We got close on one or two occasions, but it was really hard work. And of course, I think in many senses, the sustainability required a bit more scale than we had at that time.
So you mentioned research. Just to be clear, initially this campus very much focused on the teaching, and then you started to look at expanding the research.
Yes, I think that's fair. We started off with great ambitions on the research front. And there was, the campus was research active from day one, but not perhaps in the same way as we had intended, I think. So we had to put much more emphasis on teaching at the start. That was something we learned because in the early stages, you couldn't access research funds from the government until we got ourselves established. So the funding for research wasn't there. We gave staff time, but that inevitably gave some limitations to what could be done. But over time, we got the necessary approvals to access research funds provided by the Malaysian government. We were able to build labs for both teaching and research. And when it's probably going back to about 2008, I think we appointed our first research lead, our first vice provost for research. And then we started to really ramp things up. And when Malaysia did its review of research performance, we did pretty well amongst the private universities, but it was very much a long-term project.
You mentioned also that one of your aims was just to cement your place in terms of the competition, but at that point there was a bit of a sort of gold rush of branch campuses opening in Malaysia. So I mean, I know it now boasts, I think, 16 branch campuses. Given the fairly saturated state of higher education in both Kuala Lumpur and Malaysia more widely, how did you continue to stand out against this increasingly crowded backdrop?
It was quite challenging. And I think the sorts of things we focused on, we were very strong on trying to focus on employability, on the genuinely international dimension. We relied a lot on the kind of global standing of Nottingham as an institution, because we felt that was tremendously important in terms of status to students. The research again was a differentiator. But it was we as a leadership team, we made a conscious effort to get out, to be at events, to talk at events, to generally try and do a lot of thought leadership in the education sector. And we also did an awful lot of work internationally, again, to bring in the international students. Yeah, I don't think there's a silver bullet, because it was and still is a crowded marketplace, but we did have the advantage of having been one of the early players, and therefore having the scale and the range of facilities that perhaps other later entrants didn't have.
Well, it sounds like you rolled up your sleeves and got stuck in. Final question just on the running of this campus. One of the things that occurs to anyone thinking about branch campuses is a potential disconnect between the culture of the home university and its teaching and research norms and the expectations of staff and students from the host country. Did that ever create, I don't know, problems, tensions, and if so, how did you try and manage that or minimize it?
I think there's kind of almost, there's almost an inevitability that there will be diverse expectations and there will be tensions. But then actually, even within a university in the UK, with diverse groups, departments, faculties, there are some of those tensions. So I'm sort of nervous not to overplay them. But there was certainly something about how what staff came in. And I think, danger that staff come in thinking they're going to have lots and lots of research time and then discover that actually it's not quite as generous in research time as they might have hoped. They're not going to have half their time to do research and half their time to teach. So I think there is something about trying to set expectations about the role that people fulfill when they come in. And then a lot of it is about building bridges. So we were always very keen to make sure that we got people connected between the UK and Malaysia. And that made a tremendous difference. Once people, if they'd actually met, if somebody from the Malaysia campus met their counterparts in the UK, suddenly that tended to break down an awful lot of barriers and reset a lot of expectations. And that was across a range of professional services, but it was also in the academic community, and it was also actually in the student community. So we put a lot of significance to getting people to visit and getting people to talk on video links, even back in the days when you were relying on quite dated video conferencing technologies. But having those contacts made such a difference, because connecting people allowed them to share and understand each other much more effectively. So, an unavoidable challenge, and one that I think just required a lot of continuous connecting, talking, listening, and thinking about how you set expectations.
The landscape of global higher education and indeed the broader geopolitical landscape has changed a lot since 2016. Do you think the things that you were needing to focus on and the solutions and sort of ways of working that you implemented, would they still stand today, or do you think the challenge of setting up or running a branch campus has changed a lot in the 10 years since?
I'm not sure that it has, to be honest. Clearly, I can see that there is a stronger imperative for many UK institutions to look at the branch campus as a form of TNE because of the change in policy that affects international students in the UK, and therefore the ability to kind of reach out and deliver in a different context becomes increasingly appealing. I think the challenges of doing it remains significant. Anyone doing it now has the potential to learn considerably from those who've done it before. And I do think we're seeing a much greater diversity of models for branch campuses. And again, that's perhaps a product of some of the learning, but also some of the involvement of the private sector in the branch campus developments. I think one of the big things that we were starting to see when I was in Malaysia, and I think is becoming more and more apparent, is the level of regionalism and the fact that actually, to my mind, for a UK institution having a base in a significant region, whether that's South Asia, whether it's Southeast Asia, whether it's China, has the opportunity of giving that institution a hub that will allow it to engage much more widely across a particular region.
Yeah. Well, I think we've talked quite a lot about the opportunities and potential benefits of branch campuses for all parties involved. There are, however, a lot of criticisms levelled at transnational education and indeed branch campuses. So I just want to run through these with you. The first and most obvious one is quality control. So I'm sure we've all read repeated comment pieces lambasting universities for sort of subpar education provision via TNE. How big a problem do you think this actually is? And how can institutions try and ensure consistent quality standards when they are running multiple locations?
Yeah, I mean, you do hear this criticism a lot, and I think the first thing I would say is it's not intrinsic to the model of either branch campus or TNE. And I think it's about how you approach that form of delivery, the vision that you construct, and then how you deliver. So a lot of institutions have good QA systems. It's being able to replicate those and find mechanisms for sharing the expertise. So if you can take your QA system from the UK and adapt it to a different context, make sure you've got people trained. There is absolutely no reason why you can't maintain standards that are every bit as good as the UK campus. It's very much it is about having that vision.
Yes, and presumably putting the resources into ensuring the quality, because one of the things I've read is that sometimes the people checking the courses, for instance, are doing it as a bit of an afterthought on top of very, very, very full jobs, and thus just don't have the time to commit to really looking at what's being taught and how it's being taught.
So you absolutely do have to invest in it. I think it's to ensuring that the system is resourced to deliver that, and that those involved are trained, have the time. But if we think that the kind of the quality of what we do is fundamental to the status and standing of our university, it is that absolute thing you've got to get right. And I think the other thing is the recognition that actually for your QA staff are crucial, and therefore making sure that you've got your recruitment, training and development processes in place and properly managed.
Next, the next one is that this is an extractive model and is designed to generate income for the home university and simply subsidise its operations at home. And that therefore commercial considerations often risk outweighing the educational quality considerations, which rather brings us back to the
Yeah.
previous point. And I guess tied with this is whether the branch campuses are truly serving local needs. Do you see much evidence of this?
I'm not convinced. I don't think it's intrinsic to the model. I think it's fundamentally about the vision that you have when you look to establish a branch campus. And all the experience we've seen, to my mind, is that actually, if what you're really interested in is making money out of it and being able to subsidize, then you wouldn't do a branch campus in the way that we think about branch campus. It would be very short-termists. And ultimately, of course, if you try to just focus on the money making and you can't deliver in line with your reputation, your status, and your standing, then actually you'll struggle to recruit and you'll end up in a downward spiral because what you're offering is poor quality. So I don't think it does do that sort of prioritization, if I'm honest.
Yes, a lot of these criticisms are linked. So in a way, if an institution was falling foul of one of them, it's probably because they're falling foul of all of them. I
Yeah.
mean, on the flip side, I've also seen concerns raised that by focusing on big investments overseas, universities risk overlooking their local communities. So you can come at it from any angle. Another one that is a bit more common though, and there have actually been a few studies, one notably by Nigel Healy quite a few years ago now, that pointed to a lack of preparedness among staff at branch campuses. So, for instance, with leaders didn't have kind of sufficient management experience, but also highlighting an issue with faculty sometimes feeling unprepared for just the change in, I guess, educational and working cultures. What are your thoughts?
So I have a feeling that Nigel interviewed me as part of that
Oh,
study.
really?
So I think I know the study.
Yeah, well, it's
Um,
quite a well-known one.
yeah. And again, I hate to do this, but it's kind of it comes back to the sort of, well, it depends on how you go about doing it. I think inevitably the smaller size of branch campuses means that that process of kind of socializing staff who you recruit is much more difficult because they come into something that hasn't necessarily got the same infrastructure and traditions. And if you're moving out from the UK to work at a campus in another country, it's a massive change. And certainly in the early days, I don't think you necessarily, you don't always know what is going to happen, and it's hard for people to know what to expect. One of the things I think at Nottingham we attached quite a lot of importance to was the training and development of staff and making sure that things such as the training programs that we did for new academic staff that we could replicate in Malaysia and China. And we would actually send people out from the UK. So the training team who were delivering training to new academic staff in the UK would actually come out and do the same in Malaysia and China, so that we could make sure that we tried to get people familiar with the way in which the institution worked. For staff who came out from the UK, we tried quite hard in terms of connecting people and supporting people, drawing on the experience of existing staff. But I think it absolutely is a challenge. But it's something that, again, if you're thinking about that long-term vision, you want to protect quality, you recognise the fundamental importance of staff. It's something that you can prepare for and manage.
Yes, being aware of it as a clear and potential challenge is the starting point for
Mm.
that. Finally, cost. In such financially straitened times as these, is investing millions in, a shiny new campus overseas justifiable? Especially when some would point to the fact that quality TNE can be provided via distance learning. Is it perhaps more pragmatic to simply work in partnership with an existing foreign university or find a different model?
So I think it's horses for courses, isn't it? So there is an awful lot that we can do in terms of educational provision remotely, online, in partnership. The branch campus gives something a little bit different. Much, I think, depends upon the business model that is used, because that has implications for the level of investment. And it doesn't necessarily require a significant upfront capital investment from the source institution. There are other models that can be used. So not every branch campus owns its own campus. There are leasing models, there are partnership models. there are revenue sharing models. So I think the challenge currently for a UK institution looking at a branch campus is to find a business model that will work for them, that ensures that they retain enough control and influence and ability to deliver to the big picture vision without necessarily adding to some of the financial challenges that UK institutions currently face.
Yes. It would be remiss of me to let this conversation pass without touching on the government's new international education strategy, which was published mid-January. And this really sets out three key ambitions: to increase the UK's international standing through education, to sustainably recruit high quality international higher education students from, they say, a diverse range of countries, and notably to grow education exports to 40 billion a year by 2030. So that's an increase of 7 billion in the next 4 years. And it does place a lot of emphasis on transnational education as being key to that. So there are a lot of encouraging words in the strategy, but little in the way of tangible details as to how the government plans to support universities. I mean, there is reference to removing barriers to TNE expansion, whatever that means. Perhaps you could elucidate for me, what impact do you think, if any, is this strategy likely to have on UK universities' international education provision, and I guess specifically TNE?
Well, it's interesting, and as you say, it's a very high level strategy, so it's difficult to really dig in and understand some of what's likely to be going on. Clearly, there is that stronger steer towards greater TNE activity coupled with the reference to sustainable recruitment. And I think the word sustainable is probably doing a lot of heavy lifting in that phraseology. It's interesting to see the target shift from numbers to revenue. And I think we need to remember that HE is hugely important. It dominates the export numbers. But of course, the strategy does cover other areas of education. Fee-paying schools are significant, as are many of the other sort of related and supporting businesses. So I think there's to me there is that clear push towards TNE, but TNE takes lots of forms. There are a diversity of business models. I think there is some certainly implicit encouragement towards the campus models, although I think, as we've talked previously, it's not always the case that campus models necessarily generate significant revenue. Other models can do, but they would typically involve bringing students to the UK for at least part of their study period. I think one of the things that I'm very mindful of is we've got to be careful not to assume that in all of this we can simply have an extractive relationship with host countries. If we're looking for UK institutions to do a lot more delivery locally with a reliance on local investment, it's hard to see how we can simply assume that the UK awarding institution will secure significant revenue on a par with that received when students physically come to the UK. But there is that significant revenue target in the strategy. So I think there are some challenges in there. I mean, we note TNE generates about 3 billion annually, but international students to the UK are currently generating perhaps 10 times that much. So I think there's a lot to do over the next 4 years to get to that 40 billion target. And I think a heavy reliance on TNE is going to be quite challenging.
Yes, those figures that TNE generates 3 billion and international students coming to this country 10 times that. I mean, that's stark, because of course we are seeing this same government who is, in words, so encouraging of growing our international education exports, as it were, at the same time maintaining policies that are causing the number of international students coming here to decrease by quite some significance. You said at the start of our conversation that you didn't think many branch campuses were actually great money-making ventures, or indeed that higher education is a great money-making venture. And this being the case, is it sensible that the government is pushing for more money to be generated in this area?
There's an inevitable tension in there because, of course, the way in which one might generate additional revenue to the country, to higher education, the most efficient way of doing that is bringing students into the UK, where their fee income comes to the UK, but also the associated spending that comes from them living in the UK, having visitors who come to the UK, and so on. So, if you like, the most efficient way of reaching that revenue target is likely to be through students coming to the UK. And let me add to that, in terms of the experience that UK students have and international students have, the ability to spend as an undergraduate, like say 3 years living and learning together, is of huge value. So the benefit of international recruitment to the UK is more than just the financial. But certainly that would be the obvious route to reach that revenue target. If we want to say, actually, we need to be looking at TNE to do that. And again, let me stress, there are also, for international students, there are also access type benefits from TNE because, of course, it reaches talented students who couldn't otherwise come to the UK. But in terms of revenue generation back to the UK, it is a much less effective way of doing it. The benefit is to those students in their host countries, and also the benefits hugely in terms of the soft power and that first objective in the strategy. So to my mind, there is a real tension between looking to set quite a bold revenue target for 2030 and then a very strong steer that should come through partnerships internationally that involve the delivery of UK education in another country.
What would we need to see on a practical level from government that would perhaps really help UK institutions to grow internationally in terms of their transnational education provision and perhaps the establishment of branch campuses?
There is reference to the various forms of export support and kind of credit arrangements to enable institutions to fund activity overseas. But the reality is that it's hard to see how many UK institutions could be looking at significant capital investment outside of the UK simply because of the pressures that they are facing domestically. There are some undoubtedly who could but may not want to. But for most, a significant international investment overseas seems unlikely, and I'm not convinced that the availability of loan finance will actually address that. So I think you're back to looking at the partnership models that work with in-country institutions in host countries and partners bringing different things to the venture. But as soon as we look at that, then you get back to the tension of, well, the revenue flow back that the government is so interested in is going to be proportionately less. Because, as I say, we can't view it as an extractive relationship. So I actually find it quite difficult to see how that Gordian knot can be broken. And yes, there are things that undoubtedly the government can do to support. I think it might be interesting to look at whether there would be, let us say, greater flexibility in the visa regime for students coming to the UK for part of their study as opposed to the whole period. And that might be interesting because, of course, one of the barriers at the moment is if the visa regime is unsupportive, then bringing students to the UK for part of their period of study becomes less attractive and less possible. So there may be something in there, but I think ultimately there has to be some integrated approach to this that recognises the efficiency of different revenue flows and the soft power benefits of different modes of HE delivery.
Yep, as with so many things, the devil is in the detail. And in this particular case, of course, a lot of it is just coming back to pure finances.
Yeah.
Christine, thank you so much for talking to me today. It's been fantastic going through all this with you and getting your take on the nuances of branch campuses, which are often so very misunderstood.
Thanks, Miranda. It's been a pleasure.
It's not hugely surprising that adaptability and openness to learning are fundamental to creating a successful international branch campus. particularly in learning what will and won't work in that specific location. But what might raise a few eyebrows is Christine's point that branch campuses are not an effective money-making venture. There are, of course, a multitude of other benefits, but turning over a profit is unlikely to be one of them, certainly not for many years. And success will not be achieved without proper resourcing and investment. Which does call into question whether TNE can be expected to be a driver of international education revenue on a par with international student mobility. Regardless of the money, it will be exciting to see what new international branch campus endeavours take shape in the coming decade as the broader geopolitical landscape continues to change. That's it for this week. If you enjoyed the podcast, please do like and subscribe. And if you want more insight and advice on issues relating to the internationalisation of higher education, do head over to campus. That's at www.timeshighereducation.com/campus. We will be back with you in a couple of weeks. Goodbye.
You're listening to a Times Higher Education podcast.